are today, which kind of leads back to socialization, which is how you adapt to the world around you, what the norms and morals are. It all kind of traces back to how you adapted to the world as a child. So we're going to talk a little bit more about ACEs, but so see, these are some of the facts that kind of lead back to a science, which is what I'm trying to get at, is that the way we're socialized and the way we adapt to a world comes back to a science and the way that we act and behave later in life. Our society really does look at mental illness and just like unfit behaviors as very taboo. You know, if we see someone using drugs, we think they're doing it to themselves. If we see someone kind of having a hard time in school, we assume they're not trying hard enough, they're not studying hard enough, even when it comes to a science. So the facts on the board kind of talk about how trauma can impact your brain, your function, your life, and, you know, these things transfer more into your adult life than you would think. So those facts, you know, include how trauma can affect brain development, your hormonal and immune systems. It can actually impact the way your DNA is read and transcribed, which is so huge because we think, you know, these things are set in stone. We have this basis that we assume these minor or even larger things in our life aren't going to necessarily transfer over. But when it comes to a science, it's really hard to ignore the fact that these things have meaning. You know, depression isn't just a mindset. It's not all in your head per se. It's really an impacted thing stemming from how you grew up. Another fact is that childhood trauma affects the nucleus accumbens, which is the pleasure and reward part of your brain, which shows a direct relation to substance abuse. So if you've ever been downtown, any kind of sketchier areas, and you've seen drug use, or even in your family and friends and peers, and you see this drug use that you think, oh, I don't understand why this person doesn't just quit. I don't understand how this became an issue. It can really lead back to how you were raised and that environment that you grew up in. Because if you're raised in an unsafe environment, as your brain is developing, you're developing around these traumas. Your brain is adapting to these unnatural circumstances that leads to these kind of dependency issues or any issue later in life. And that's enough facts for today, but I will leave this up for a second. So where I found out about ACEs, adverse childhood experience, is from Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, and she has a TED Talk that I'm going to show you a couple minutes of where she talks about it. She's a doctor, and she discovered this, and you know, something she said is everyone should know about this, which I completely agree, because in our age group, it's hard to understand ourselves sometimes, our peers sometimes, parents, teachers. It's hard to kind of relate and just transfer that information because it can just be difficult, and we see a lot that we don't understand. Even if we're trying to process, even if we're trying to understand, it really does come to a science of why things can be a little bit different. So I'm going to show you a clip of her video. I guess I already had it up. So I'm going to start at right there. And tell me if you guys can hear. I'm hoping you'll be able to.
I can't really hear it.
You can't hear it? Let me see. Is it quiet or can you just not hear it at all?
It's really quiet.
Is this a little better? It's still quiet? Okay, I'll try to turn on my actual computer.
Maybe you could try sharing sound on the via Zoom.
Oh, you're smart. Okay, let's see. I think. Yeah, I think. Nope, that is not correct for me. Okay. Up here, I have. If you guys can't hear it, I can just repeat what she is saying. But I will leave a link in the end of my thing that will lead you to if you want to check it out. Um, okay, so basically what she's talking about is the fact that there are many health factors that are related to trauma as a child. It's not just psychological. So what she was saying is if you grow up in an unsafe environment, you know, if you have a rough childhood, people are like, oh, well, it makes sense that you would, you know, be more likely to engage in high risk activity, you know, doing drugs or, you know, there's a school to prison pipeline. There's a lot of these things that we already know. You know, we already know that if you grow up in a rough area, it's more likely that you'll stay in that place as opposed to find a way out of it. However, what she's explaining in this video is that it comes more to a science than we actually think. It comes down to the way that our brain is going to process the environment around us and what is safe, what is not, how much do we care, what are we willing to risk. It comes down to that depending on if you were in a safe or unsafe environment growing up. However, it's hard for us to understand that even still because from a young age, it's drilled into us that someone is simply not trying hard enough if they are not normal. If you don't function properly in this society, even if you're just a little bit awkward, even if sometimes it's hard to make friends, even if you're sometimes depressed, what we see that is not trying hard enough, is not pulling yourself up by the bootstraps. And it leads to a lot of people masking how they truly feel or masking something they may be struggling with, whether it's mental or even a health situation. And it's hard for us to have empathy because we see negative representation of mental health in media, in TV, in books from a young age. I don't know how many of you could say that your parents ever sat down with you and had a have a conversation with you about mental health. You know, when you were growing up, was it something talked about? Probably not, unless your parents are like super aware of these kinds of things. But our generation is more aware than past generations, which means probably a lot of that information wasn't transferred through means of parents or family, which means a lot of it was actually you're taking that in from watching TV shows. Even cartoons have mention of suicide, of being crazy or loony, and it was funny, it was comedy. It was the crazy characters that were usually the bad guys or the people that needed to be taken care of. And we never got to sit down and listen to the facts and to the science and understand these feelings are valid, they're normal. These individuals, myself or others, have valid reason for what they are doing, the actions that they have chosen to be part of. So it's hard to have empathy, is what I'm kind of reaching for. It's hard to have empathy for an issue if we can't see it with our eyes. I know that for me, you know, it's easy to have empathy for a child who isn't getting their need met. It's easy to have empathy for someone who has a physical disability because you can see what's happening. You can see, oh, this person is unable to walk. And then you can kind of put yourself in their shoes and understand, oh, it must be hard to not be able to walk. It must be hard to function in this world when you don't fit into it in a perfect little box. But it's harder for us to have that same empathy for someone whose disability we can't see. So when someone is depressed, but they still get dressed in the morning and they still go to school, it's hard to have empathy because we're like, well, you can function. You must be choosing not to. You can get up in the morning. You just don't want to. And so it's just hard to translate the message that it is a science, not a choice. It is a series of events that leads to something, not just a switch flip. And that mental illness isn't dangerous in and of itself. The society that we have made it so hard to function in is what makes things dangerous or what makes things hard. So I don't want to say that it's impossible to come back from. I'm just saying that it's hard to change and make changes when this is a stigma in our society. You know, racism, sexism, homophobia, there's all types of things and intersectionalities that America and just the world as a whole fails to take into account when we build society and systems to try to help people reach their full potential. Two students could be going to the same school in the same class, but if you have a mental illness that is invisible, that is hard to have empathy for because it's maybe hard to verbalize to others, your likelihood of living a healthy and successful and just an easier life is going to probably be, it's going to be harder for you than for someone who doesn't struggle with anything mentally, who doesn't have things going on at home that make it hard for them to go to school. And I think to end this hopefully on a happier note, I would like to point out that our generation and like millennials, but just younger generation, we're able to see this more. You know, you want to understand yourself and you want to understand your peers more than people have before. And we have online, we have social media, we have means of reaching out and building communities and doing classes like this to share what we know and learn about what we don't know. And it's difficult to be in this generation, and I'm not trying to say that as a cliche, but we really do have a lot of generational trauma, and we do have a lot of knowledge that may be hard to swallow at times, but we understand these systems that are flawed. We understand that change needs to happen, and understanding yourself and your peers and behavior is definitely a way to start inciting that change. And I am definitely going to run. I did a little bit fast on time, so we'll probably get out early and I'll let you guys ask some questions. But before that, I would like to say that if you are interested in this, I'm going to have us do one activity around ACEs, but if you want to kind of get into this on your own, I highly recommend you read The Social Animal by Elliot Aronson and watch the Nadine Burke Harris TED Talk that I tried to show you, which I'll leave this link up, or maybe I'll put it in the Zoom chat. It's very eye-opening and it may help you understand yourself as well as your peers. So the last thing before I'll open up for some questions is I want you guys to do something with me, and I'm going to have us go through some of the ACE questions, which are kind of intense, and I'm not going to ask you to share your score or share anything about it if you don't want to, but I'm going to have you tally either on your fingers or on your phone or on a piece of paper 1 point for every question that you can agree with or that you relate to. So I'll give you guys a second to get anything you want prepared. Okay, is everyone somewhat ready? Okay, so if these questions are too intense as well, you don't have to participate. This is kind of just for you to see where you are. And I think that being able to relate to something or to the system I'm talking about is going to be something that'll help you become more engaged and maybe try to look into this later in life, because it really does open a lot of doors, and it's going to help you want to be more part of your community and understand people and yourself a little bit better. So question number 1, and just one tally for every question you agree with or that you can relate to, and if you don't relate to it, just don't tally anything. Question 1. Did a parent or other adult in your household often or very often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, or act in a way that made you feel afraid you might be physically hurt? So if that's something you can relate to, tally a 1. Number 2, did a parent or adult in your household often make you feel or often push, grab, slap, or throw something at you, or ever hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured? So if that's you, another tally. Did an adult or person of at least 5 years older than you ever touch or fondle you or try to have intercourse with you without your consent? Did you often or very often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought that you were important or special, or your family didn't look out for each other or feel close to each other or support each other? So if that applies to you, do a check. That can even just mean that most times growing up you didn't feel accepted or you didn't feel supported for maybe sexuality, for belief system, for anything. It can just be a feeling that you had. It doesn't have to be anything specific. Did you often or very often feel that you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, and had no one to protect you, or your parents were too drunk or high to take care of you or take you to the doctor if you needed it? So this one speaks to neglect. If you ever felt like you were your own parent or you had to watch out for yourself more than any parental role ever watched out for you, then that it does apply to you. Was a biological parent ever lost to you through divorce, abandonment, or other reasons? Was your mother or stepmother often or very often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at her, or ever hit repeatedly, often in a 5-minute span, or over, or threatened with a gun or knife? So were you ever a witness to domestic violence in your house growing up? I have a couple more questions. Did you ever live with anyone who was a problem drinker or alcoholic or used street drugs? And that doesn't have to be a parent, just anyone that you were in proximity with a lot growing up in your household or a family member. Was a household member ever depressed or mentally ill, or did a household member attempt suicide while you were growing up? And the last question is, did a household member ever go to prison when you were growing up? And so whatever you have tallied on or kept up with, that is your ACE score. Different amounts of scores that you can agree with can mean different things for your development, can mean different things for your health. And it's not that if you have a high score, you are doomed to fall into a stereotype. It does not mean that you are a victim or that you are your trauma. It just means that you have this impact and you have this weight that you carry and other people may not know about. I know these things aren't talked about in school. These things aren't talked about in professional world or even with family. And so it's a lot of you storing things. Even if your score is low and you can't really relate to a lot of this, your peers, your family, the world around you, there is a high chance that you know someone who checks off every one of those 10 questions. There is a high chance that you know someone who will have a higher or a lower ACE score than you. Everyone falls somewhere on this spectrum, and that means that it's going to impact you in different ways, but this score impacts every single one of us, no matter what it was. And you don't need to share, but if anyone wants to talk about anything this brought up for them, or if you maybe didn't think that you would relate to these questions, but it kind of opened your eyes to something, feel free to just say anything this activity made you think about. Yeah, it's kind of intense. And it makes sense that it would be kind of heavy. I have taken this test as well, And it didn't always sit well with me that I had a score, that I was kind of a number on the spectrum. But something that opened my eyes when I took this is that it validated experiences that I didn't know led to behaviors I didn't know were taken into consideration in the world. And they should be taken into consideration more. But these parts of your childhood, these parts of your development, they don't have to define you, but you should definitely look at them. You should definitely talk about them at some point. You should definitely understand that those experiences do help shape who you are. And that can be in a positive way. You can take these experiences and you can use it to look at the world through a more empathetic lens. I know that after I took this score, after I watched this TED Talk and read these books, I looked at my peers in a different way. I went to school and thought, I wonder what these people's ACE scores are. I wonder what these people still experience at home. I wonder how this is going to impact these people when they grow up. I wonder how it's going to impact me when I grow up. And you can really choose how you want to look at this. But if you take anything away from that activity, I hope you understand that you are so strong. No matter if your ACE score is a 1, a 0, or it's a 10, you have made it to this Zoom call. You have made it this little class. You are trying to understand yourself better. You are trying to understand the world better. And it's a crazy time to try to do that. But it's also a time full of a lot of opportunity to do that if you look at it through a different lens. And being here, I hope that you kind of learned a little bit about yourself or a little bit about the world. And that's all we can kind of do is try to understand those things better. So these are my sources. And also, if you want to reach out, I will come back over here or try to come back over here because I am so bad at technology. Stop. I'm going to put my email in the chat and you guys can email me with any kind of questions. You can email me if you want me to send you a link to the YouTube videos or to, book ideas, or if you really just like have an experience that you want to share or talk about the ACE score. I'm probably never going to meet any of you, which means that it's like impossible for me to share these things or judge you. I can literally just be your online pen pal and we can talk about whatever you want. So I'll put that in here. And I will open it up for any questions that anyone has. It can be about what we just did, or it can be about anything.
So I came in late, and I was just interested in like how this ACE scale, I guess, was developed. Like, is it based off psychological stuff?
So it's honestly not a very old kind of theory or survey. And honestly, we didn't really start taking mental health into account as a science or as something that'll impact humans as a whole, which is ridiculous. But we didn't start taking that into account until somewhat recently. And so it came about. I'll put the TED Talk name into the chat. It's really interesting. It's like 15 minutes. But it came about because a lot of doctors and people who work specifically with kids and teens noticed they were diagnosing things like ADHD and OCD and these like interesting disorders that are hard to diagnose. They were doing it at such high rates that they were like, why are these kids having these issues at such a young age? What leads to this? And then they started noticing increased amounts like relation between kids who experienced trauma and kids who were being diagnosed with these weird, interesting disorders that we don't see in kids so much naturally occurring. So they decided to kind of put together a trauma scale survey, and they asked adults, they asked kids, and the numbers were just insane. The fact that these health issues, not even neurologic disorders, things like heart failure, things like high blood sugar, these health issues that we wouldn't assume have any relation to mental illness, they started linking those things because it turns out trauma early on impacts your brain in such a way that it impacts the whole rest of your body. It impacts the whole rest of your life. So it kind of started just trying to relate, why would people have these increasing issues when they don't have any other pre-existing health issues? And it all kind of stemmed back to a mental side of things. But that's a good question.
I have a question. You may have already said this, so I apologize if I'm just making you repeat yourself. But how does this relate to the question at the beginning about a tree falling and
Right.
down?
Right. So I didn't explain that. So that was kind of to hook your guys' attention, and also it was kind of to try to have you look through a different perspective, to try to answer these questions that are hard. Like, they're just don't always make sense. They don't always have super clear answers. Like, if a tree falls in a forest and nothing is around to hear it, doesn't make sound. That question in and of itself, like, it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with mental health. However, sound is a human constructed thing. The way our society views mental illness is a human constructed thing. It's a socialized thing. And so I was kind of just trying to lead you into questions that don't always have clear answers, if that makes any sense. It's also just a cool fact. Like, when I heard that, I was so confused, but then it really did make sense. Does anyone else have any questions? In the chat. And again, if you have questions that you don't want to ask on here or you don't want me to verbally answer, please do email me, because this is something I'm super interested in, and I will not judge you as a person. I will not judge the experiences you've had. I literally am some kid from Washington State that just likes the brain and likes psychology, and so I really am like not going to be rude about it. Feel free to ask as many questions as you would like. And I'll leave this up for a second. I put the TED Talk and my email address into the chat, so if you want to write anything down or ask any last questions, I will stay on for like 5 minutes.
So I have like a random question. I guess relating to trauma, would you consider like the whole COVID thing that we're going through like a trauma that everybody's like going through?
Yeah, so when I said something about generational trauma in relation to our generation, that is kind of what this type of thing is. And obviously, this is so unknown, this like worldwide pandemic. This is definitely a trauma. And the reason it can be defined as that is because our development and our brain and the way we view things is going to be changed by this if it hasn't already been. You know, we are isolated and we are missing out on formative years of our life. I know I am a junior and I would be learning to drive right now. I would be doing things right now. And, you know, this is going to have changed the outlook on the world that we currently have. And the generational trauma aspect, we also, during this time of isolation, have so much access to news, to information that years and years ago during a pandemic, people wouldn't have access to all these heartbreaking events that are taking place around the world. They wouldn't have the knowledge of something happening in China or in Iran. We wouldn't have that knowledge until years later when it was put in a book by some white dude and sent to schools, and then they were like, oh my God, that's crazy. But we have access to it as it's happening. And so not only are we isolated and dealing with something that no one ever has, we're also taking on the weight of these traumas that are happening around the world. Even if they don't directly impact us, we're carrying that. So it's gonna be really interesting. And I feel for like the sixth graders who have to read 2020 in their history books, because that is gonna be a long chapter. There's so much that happened this year. It's like all of us have probably been impacted in different ways, but this experience, I know for me, is going to be something that I carry on into adulthood. And I think that a lot of the psychology and the studies I actually shared are going to have to alter some of their thinking to adjust to what our generation is going to be going through and what our generation is going to have to adapt to as well. And in the chat, Cindy said, I'm curious as how it will be written depending on the perspectives. And that is something that's super interesting also in our current time, because the news we're receiving is all written by people, right? It's all going to be biased. So depending on where I live in Washington State, I may be receiving a biased information that you guys would receive a completely different one. Or, you know, we're going to be receiving the same kind of information, but from a different bias and a different perspective. And I think that these facts and this year and everything is going to be summed up from all kinds of perspectives as well. And it will be interesting to see how that happens. Honestly, one of us could be the next author of the chapter of 2020, or write some narrative or write some book about how crazy this year was, because that would be super interesting and I would read it. And if you write a book, please email me, I will read it. These are super cool questions. And I put my email in there, so don't feel freaked out to email me, because all of these questions are great so far. Thank you guys so much for joining this too. I wasn't expecting much to show up, because I know we're all in a weird time. Thank you guys. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day or night or whatever time it is there. Bye.